The damp chill of a London evening clung to Alistair Finch's overcoat as he stepped out of the historic Finch & Sons publishing house. The courtyard, paved with cobblestones, slick with a fine mist, was empty. The gaslight-style lamps, a concession to tradition he'd fought to keep, cast long, wavering shadows that made the familiar space feel alien and unwelcoming. At 62, Alistair felt a weariness that settled deeper than his bones. It was the weariness of a man who had become a ghost in his own legacy. He ran a hand over his tired face, the lonely click-clack of his leather-soled shoes, the only sound in the unnerving silence. For over a century, Finch & Sons had been a bastion of literary tradition, a name synonymous with quality and integrity, built by his grandfather and nurtured by his father. But now it felt more like a beautiful, decaying mausoleum of memories. The impending deal, the sale of his family's heritage to a faceless multinational conglomerate, was presented by his nephew as a triumph, a necessary step into the future. To Alistair, it felt like a capitulation, the final quiet closing of a book he was not ready to finish. His car, a vintage 1965 Bentley S3 in a deep racing green, waited for him in its designated spot. It had been his father's pride and joy, a relic much like himself in a world obsessed with speed and disposability. As he retrieved the heavy, ornate key from his pocket, the polished brass cool against his skin, the silence was abruptly broken. "Be quiet." The voice was a child's whisper, sharp and clear as splintered glass. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Alistair froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. He scanned the empty, shadowed courtyard, his heart giving a sudden heavy thud against his ribs. The strain of the past few weeks must be getting to him. A trick of the wind, perhaps, or a memory echoing through the old stones. The city playing games with a tired old man. He shook his head, a faint dismissive smile touching his lips, and reached for the handle again. They're listening. This time there was no mistaking it. The voice was definite, urgent, and it came from inside the Bentley. Alistair's breath hitched. His mind, usually a calm library of thoughts, raced through a dozen frantic possibilities. He slowly, deliberately unlocked the door and eased it open. The interior smelled of old leather wood polish and his late wife's faint, lingering scent of lavender potpourri. And there, huddled on the cavernous leather of the back seat, was a small, huddled figure. It was a little girl, no older than 8. She was black, with large, intelligent eyes that were wide and luminous in the gloom. Fear was etched into her small features, but beneath it a spark of fierce determination flickered. She was wearing a simple, clean but well-worn coat, and clutched tightly in her lap was a book. A faded hardcover edition of The Wind in the Willows, one of the first children's classics ever published by Finch & Sons. Alistair stood there speechless, a strange tableau of the past and the present. He wasn't frightened, merely stunned into absolute stillness. "How?" he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. The girl pressed a tiny finger to her lips, her eyes darting towards the grand illuminated windows of the main building behind him. The executive offices on the top floor were still lit. "Julian's office. Your nephew?" She whispered, her voice barely audible. "And the blonde woman. They said you'd be leaving now. They're watching from the window." Alistair felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Julian, his own sister's son, the boy he had raised like his own after her passing. And the blonde woman, Amelia Vance, his ruthlessly efficient, ever-present assistant. He had trusted them implicitly. Julian handled the finances, Amelia his life. They were the architects of this sale, the ones who assured him it was the only way. Without a word, trying to make his movements seem casual to any watching eyes, Alistair slid into the driver's seat and closed the heavy door with a soft, solid thud. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, the scent of lavender seeming to mock his solitude. He turned slightly, looking at the child in his rearview mirror. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and steady, trying not to frighten her further. "Alara." She replied, her gaze still fixed on the window of the building. "My grandmother. She used to clean here, years ago." That explained nothing and everything. The building had 100 hidden corners, 100 ways for a small, quiet child to go unnoticed. "They said you're a sentimental old fool." Alara continued her words, a direct, unvarnished report of what she'd overheard. "They said you'd sign the papers tomorrow without even reading them properly because you trust them." Each word was a small, sharp stone striking him. Sentimental old fool. It was exactly what he feared he had become. He had delegated, trusted, and retreated into the comfortable world of manuscripts and memories, leaving the harsh realities of business to Julian and Amelia. He had mistaken his trust for prudence, his sentimentality for wisdom. The lights in the top-floor office went out. "They're coming down," Alara whispered urgently, shrinking further into the seat. "Please, just drive." Alistair's hands, which had felt so old and tired moments ago, were now steady on the polished wooden steering wheel. The weariness had evaporated, replaced by a cold rising tide of clarity. For the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of the shrewd businessman his father had raised him to be. He turned the key. The Bentley's engine purred to life, a deep, dignified rumble that seemed to absorb the silence of the courtyard. He could see two figures emerging from the grand entrance of the publishing house, Julian tall and confident in his tailored suit, and Amelia, her blonde hair a pale beacon under the lamplight. They were laughing together, their heads close, sharing a private joke. The image of their intimacy sent a fresh wave of ice through Alistair's veins. He didn't wait for them to approach. He put the car into gear. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound as the Bentley ghosted out of the courtyard, carrying the publisher and his tiny, terrified oracle into the uncertain London night. The Bentley moved through the labyrinth of London's streets like a silent green phantom. Inside, the world was hushed, insulated from the city's nocturnal hum by thick glass and decades of craftsmanship. Rain began to speckle the windscreen, the wipers swishing back and forth in a gentle, hypnotic rhythm. For several long minutes, neither Alistair nor his small passenger spoke. Alara remained huddled in the back, her eyes occasionally flitting to the rearview mirror as if expecting to see Julian's sleek black Jaguar in pursuit. Alistair's mind, however, was a storm of fractured thoughts and chilling recollections. Sentimental old fool. The words echoed each repetition, peeling back another layer of his denial. He thought of Julian's constant reassurances, his talk of streamlining the legacy and securing your retirement. He remembered Amelia's solicitous smiles, the way she managed his diary with an air of fierce protectiveness that he had mistaken for loyalty. He had seen it as care. They had seen it as control. He finally broke the silence, his voice softer than he intended. "Where do you live, Alara Lambeth?" she whispered. "With my gran." He nodded, calculating the distance. Before he took her home, he needed answers. More than that, he needed a moment of stillness to truly absorb the magnitude of what she had told him. He couldn't go to his own home, a place Amelia had a key to. He couldn't go to the police, not yet, not with the word of a child against his own flesh and blood. He needed a neutral ground, a place of warmth and light. He turned the car down a quiet side street in Bloomsbury, pulling up in front of a small, inviting cafe. Its bow window was steamed up against the cold, and a simple wooden sign hanging from a wrought iron bracket read, "The Page and Kettle." It was one of the few independent places left a haven for students and book lovers. "Will you join me for a cup of hot chocolate?" he asked, turning to look at her properly for the first time. "I think we both could use one." Alara hesitated for only a second before giving a small, determined nod. Inside, the cafe smelled of coffee, old paper, and cinnamon. It was quiet, with only a few patrons hunched over laptops and books. Alistair led Alara to a secluded booth in the corner, helping her out of her coat. He ordered 2 deluxe hot chocolates and a plate of shortbread biscuits from the friendly woman at the counter, who gave him a curious but kind smile. When the drinks arrived in large, comforting mugs topped with mountains of whipped cream, Alara's tense shoulders seemed to relax for the first time. She took a careful sip, leaving a white mustache on her upper lip, which she wiped away with a serious expression. "Now," Alistair said, gently leaning forward. "Please, Alara, tell me everything you heard. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small it seems." Her eyes, dark and serious over the rim of her mug, met his. "I was in the old archives," she began. "Sometimes Mrs. Gable she cleans. Now she's my gran's friend, lets me sit in there while she works. She knows I like the smell of the old books." Alistair nodded. The archives were directly below the main boardroom. The old building had quirks, including a ventilation grate that connected the 2 floors long since forgotten by everyone. "They came in after everyone else had gone home," Alara continued. "Your nephew, Mr. Croft." He was laughing. He said, "The old man has finally taken the bait. Tomorrow he'll sign his own death warrant and thank us for the pen." Alistair felt the warmth from his own mug fail to reach his hands. "The blonde woman, Miss Vance, she said you wouldn't even check the final clauses. She said she'd swapped the last page of the contract this afternoon, the one with the director's liability." Alara stumbled over the unfamiliar words. "She said it would make you responsible for all the company's debts." but the sale money would go to a new holding company he controls. It was a classic brutal corporate maneuver, a trap built on years of trust. They weren't just selling the company, they were planning to bankrupt him personally and steal the proceeds. They said other things. Alara said, her voice dropping. She looked down at the table, pushing a crumb of shortbread with her finger. They said it was a shame your wife wasn't alive to see how pathetic you'd become. They said she was the one with the real spine. That was the blow that struck home a cruel, calculated barb that went deeper than any financial betrayal. A wave of cold fury washed over Alistair so profound it left him breathless. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. "How did you get into my car?" he asked, his voice now dangerously calm. "When I heard them leaving, I got scared. I ran down the back stairs to the courtyard. I was going to hide, but your car door was unlocked. Mrs. Gable told me sometimes the latch sticks if you don't slam it, so I got in and hid on the floor. It made a terrible simple sense. A faulty latch on a vintage car, a child's fear, and a criminal conversation overheard by chance. A series of tiny random events had conspired to save him. He looked at the girl opposite him. She was finishing her hot chocolate, her small face a mask of solemnity. She had risked a great deal to warn him, a complete stranger. "Why Alara?" he asked. "Why did you help me?" She put her mug down and looked at the book she had brought with her, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. "My gran told me Finch & Sons wasn't just a building. She said it was a place that made magic. She said your father once gave her a copy of this book when she was a little girl, and it changed her life." She looked up, her gaze direct and unwavering. "They were talking about you like you didn't matter, like you were just a thing in their way, but you're the one who makes the magic." The simple, profound sincerity of her words moved Alistair more than any tribute or award he had ever received. The seeds of doubt Alara had planted in the car had now taken root, growing into a terrible, unshakable certainty. He paid the bill, his movements precise and deliberate. As they walked back to the Bentley, the rain had softened to a fine drizzle. He drove her to the address in Lambeth, a clean but weathered council estate. Before she got out, he took a pen and a business card from his wallet, writing his personal mobile number on the back. "Alara," he said, handing it to her, "you have done a braver thing tonight than most adults would dare. Do not speak of this to anyone, but if you or your grandmother need anything at all, you call this number, day or night. Do you understand?" She nodded, clutching the card like a precious treasure. "Are you going to be okay, Mr. Finch?" For the first time that night, Alistair felt a genuine smile form. It was a grim smile, but a real one. "Yes, Alara," he said, the cold fury in his chest now hardening into resolve. "I believe I am." He watched her disappear into the building before driving away. As the Bentley glided through the wet, empty streets towards his own silent, opulent house, he knew his life had irrevocably fractured. The man who had left the office that evening was gone. In his place was someone else, someone colder, clearer, and far more dangerous. The sentimental old fool was dead. Alistair Finch was very much alive. Alistair's flat in Kensington was a place of curated silence. It occupied the entire second floor of a grand Victorian townhouse with high ceilings, ornate cornices, and windows that overlooked a private garden square. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every first-edition book lining the walls of his study had been chosen with care over a lifetime. It was a beautiful space, a testament to a life of success and taste. And tonight, it felt like a magnificent gilded cage. He entered the cavernous living room, the thick Persian rug swallowing the sound of his footsteps. The air was still and cool. Since his wife Eleanor had passed away 3 years ago, the flat had become less of a home and more of a museum to their life together. It was impeccably clean, thanks to a weekly service, but it lacked the lived-in warmth, the gentle chaos of a shared existence. It was the perfect lonely fortress for a sentimental old fool. He walked to the mahogany sideboard, his movements stiff and automatic. He poured himself a generous measure of single malt whiskey, forgoing the usual ice and water. He needed its raw, smoky fire. He stood by the tall window, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, and looked down at the rain-swept street. The city lights blurred into a watercolor of gold and silver. Alara's words played over and over in his mind, a relentless, damning litany. "He'll sign his own death warrant and thank us for the pen. A shame your wife wasn't alive to see how pathetic you'd become." The betrayal was in physical entity, a cold, heavy weight pressing down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. As if summoned by his thoughts, his phone lying on a polished side table vibrated with a soft, insidious buzz. He walked over and picked it up. 2 new messages. The first was from Julian. Uncle just checking you got home all right. Get some rest. Big day tomorrow. We're on the cusp of securing everything you've worked for. Leave the stress to us. The condescension once invisible to him was now blindingly obvious. Leave the stress to us. The words of a patient heir managing a senile patriarch. Alistair's thumb hovered over the screen, his first instinct to type a furious accusatory reply. He stopped himself. Not yet. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. The second message was from Amelia. Alistair, hope the evening finds you well. The final document binders are on your desk for the morning. Everything is perfect. As always, I've got your back. Couldn't ask for a better mentor. See you tomorrow. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost artistic. Couldn't ask for a better mentor. She had learned from him, yes. She had studied his trust, his decency, his deep-seated belief in the goodness of others, and had meticulously weaponized it all against him. The intimacy of her betrayal was a special kind of poison. She organized his life, knew his schedule, his favorite blend of tea, the anniversary of his wife's death, which she always marked with a simple bouquet of freesias on his desk. He sank into a leather armchair that still bore the faint imprint of his body. The messages so innocuous just hours ago now felt like taunts. He closed his eyes, and the pain of the betrayal brought forth a memory sharp and unwelcome. He was standing in a cold church, the air thick with the scent of lilies and damp stone. A much younger Julian, all of 16, was clutching his hand, his small body trembling with grief. Alistair's sister Julian's mother was gone. Alistair had pulled the boy into an embrace, whispering a promise into his hair. I will always look after you. You are my son now. He had meant it. He had funded Julian's education at Cambridge, brought him into the company, groomed him, celebrated his successes as if they were his own. He had given him a family, a future, a legacy. In return, Julian was preparing to strip him of everything and leave him destitute, all while calling him uncle. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Alistair sat up, the grief hardening into something else, something cold and sharp. Resolve. He would not drown in sorrow. He would not be the victim in their sordid little play. He stood, leaving his half-finished whiskey on the table, and walked with a firm new purpose into his study. The study was his sanctuary. Books from floor to ceiling, the scent of leather and aging paper, his father's immense oak desk dominating the room. He sat in the worn leather chair, the same one his father had sat in, and opened his laptop. For years he had accepted Julian's financial reports without question. He had approved Amelia's reorganizations and new protocols with a trusting nod. No more. He began to trawl through years of archived emails, his eyes now open, searching for the red flags he had so willfully ignored. There it was, an email from 6 months ago. Julian explaining a series of large consulting fees to a firm Alistair had never heard of, Vance & Croft Holdings. At the time, Julian had brushed it off as standard corporate restructuring, too tedious to bore you with. Now the names felt like a slap in the face. And another. A year back, a memo from Amelia strongly recommending the early retirement of Mr. Abernathy, their head accountant for 40 years, a man of fierce loyalty and meticulous detail. He was replaced by a younger, more dynamic man handpicked by Julian. They had been removing the old guard, anyone who might question their numbers. He kept digging, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He found Amelia's proposals for a new encrypted digital filing system, one to which he had only limited access to streamline his workflow. He had seen it as her being efficient. He now saw it as her building a cage around his information, walling him off from the truth of his own company. Each email, each memo, each report was a single thread in a vast, intricate web of deceit they had woven around him. They had not decided to betray him yesterday. This had been years in the planning, years of smiles, of feigned loyalty, of patient predatory circling. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the grim set of his jaw. The pain was still there, a deep throbbing ache in his soul, but now it was accompanied by a glacial rage. They had mistaken his kindness for weakness. They had seen his trust as an invitation to plunder. They thought the story was over, that the final chapter was already written by their hands. They were wrong. He was Alistair Finch. The blood of generations of publishers, of storytellers and truth-seekers ran in his veins, and he would be the author of the final chapter. He closed the laptop. The silence of the gilded cage no longer felt oppressive. It felt like the calm before a storm. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't fight them on their terms in a world of spreadsheets and legal jargon he no longer fully commanded. He needed an old ally, someone who understood the darker side of human nature, someone who knew how to hunt in the shadows. He picked up his phone, his thumb scrolling past Julian's and Amelia's names to a number he hadn't dialed in over a decade. The hunt had begun. The Athenaeum Club on Pall Mall was an institution carved from stone leather and silence. It was a place where prime ministers had conferred, where novelists had dreamed up their masterpieces, and where secrets were kept with the same reverence as the rare books in its famous library. Alistair's father had been a member, as had his grandfather. Alistair himself rarely visited, finding the atmosphere a little too steeped in patriarchal history, a little too resistant to the pull of the modern world. But tonight its old-world solemnity was exactly what he needed. He had arranged the meeting with a single cryptic text message: "Arthur, I need your help. An urgent and delicate matter. The Athenaeum 9 tomorrow morning. Alistair." The reply had come within a minute. "I'll be there." At precisely 9 o'clock, Alistair was seated in a secluded alcove of the club's morning room, a pot of untouched Earl Grey tea steaming before him. He watched as Arthur Davies entered the room. Arthur was a man who seemed to have been born in a tweed jacket. At 65, he was a few years older than Alistair, with a shock of unruly grey hair, a weathered face etched with the lines of 1,000 observations, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. Those eyes, Alistair knew, missed nothing. Arthur had been a detective chief inspector at Scotland Yard, a man renowned for his doggedness and an almost supernatural ability to unravel complex financial crimes. He'd retired 5 years ago after a distinguished but quiet career, refusing a peerage to open a small, highly selective private investigation agency. He was, as Alistair's father had once fondly described him, the most honorable bloodhound in London. "Alistair," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He slid into the leather armchair opposite, declining the waiter's offer of a drink with a simple wave of his hand. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Arthur Alistair replied, his voice strained. "I've seen a monster that I thought was my own son." For the next 20 minutes, Alistair laid out the story. He spoke in a low, measured tone, recounting Alara's warning in the Bentley, the overheard conversation, the chilling discovery of the late-night emails. He omitted nothing, not even the cruelest personal barbs. He presented the facts as he knew them, stripped of the raw emotion that had consumed him the night before. Arthur listened without interruption. He didn't take notes. He simply watched Alistair's face, his gaze steady and intense, as if he were reading a manuscript for hidden meanings and subtext. When Alistair finished, the silence in the alcove felt heavy and profound. Arthur leaned back, stroking his chin. "Julian Croft," he said more to himself than to Alistair. "I remember him as a boy at your sister's funeral. A quiet lad. And Amelia Vance. The name is unfamiliar. She's been my PA." "For nearly 8 years," Alistair said bitterly. "Efficient, ambitious, apparently a very talented actress. Greed is a powerful motivator," Arthur said, his tone matter-of-fact. "But this has the flavor of something more personal. Resentment, perhaps. A desire not just to take your money, but to humiliate you in the process." He paused, his sharp eyes locking onto Alistair's. "The child, Alara. You're certain she's reliable? I would stake what's left of my life on it," Alistair said without hesitation. There was a truth in her eyes. "Arthur, that I haven't seen in my own boardroom for years." Arthur gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Good. The testimony of a child, especially an outsider, is often the purest you'll get. They haven't yet learned the art of self-serving revision." He leaned forward, his professional demeanor now fully engaged. The friendly acquaintance was gone, replaced by the detective. "So we have a conspiracy to defraud centered on a contract you're meant to sign tomorrow. The timeline is critical. We have less than 24 hours. What can we do?" Alistair asked, a desperate edge to his voice. "Go to the police." Arthur shook his head dismissively. "Not yet. This is a complex white-collar crime. You'd be buried in paperwork. They'd interview Julian and Amelia, who would express shock and concern for your failing memory and age-related paranoia. They'd paint you as a confused old man lashing out because he can't accept the sale of his family business. By the time the authorities untangled the lies, the company would be sold and the money would be in an untraceable offshore account. No, we don't go to the police. We bring the police to them with a case tied up in a neat little bow." A glimmer of hope, the first he'd felt, sparked within Alistair. "Here's what we need." Arthur continued, tapping a finger on the polished table to punctuate his points. "First, concrete proof of the fraudulent contract, a copy of the original and the altered version. Second evidence of the financial malfeasance that necessitated this sale in the first place, the shell companies, the embezzled funds. Third, and this is crucial, we need to catch them in the act of finalizing their deception. We need their arrogance to be their undoing. He looked at Alistair. This will require you to perform, Alistair. You must go back to your office today and play the part they've cast for you, the trusting, sentimental fool. You must be charming, compliant, and completely oblivious. Can you do that? The thought of facing Julian and Amelia, of smiling while his heart was filled with rage, was nauseating. But he saw the cold logic in Arthur's plan. I will, he said, his voice firm. Good, Arthur said, a rare thin smile touching his lips. While you're giving your award-winning performance, I'll start digging. I still have friends in certain financial institutions. People who owe me favors. I'll look into this Vance & Croft Holdings. And I have a man, an expert in digital forensics, who can take a look at your company's server. Anonymously, of course. He stood up, the meeting concluded. One more thing, Alistair. This girl, Alara, they saw her in the building. If they begin to suspect a leak, she could be in danger. They might not see her as a threat, but desperate people do foolish things. Alistair's blood ran cold. He hadn't even considered that. I'll have one of my people keep a discreet eye on her and her grandmother today, Arthur assured him. Just a precaution. Go to your office. Stick to the script. I'll be in touch. Arthur turned and walked away, melting back into the club's quiet wood-paneled world. Alistair sat for a moment, the tea in his pot now cold. The fear was still there, but it was no longer a paralyzing fog. Arthur had given it a shape, a structure. He had provided a map through the treacherous landscape of the betrayal. Alistair Finch was no longer a victim waiting for the axe to fall. He was a player in a dangerous game, and he had just brought a grandmaster onto his side of the board. Alistair's return to Finch & Sons was one of the hardest things he had ever had to do. As he walked through the grand oak-paneled lobby, the familiar scent of books and beeswax felt tainted. He nodded to the receptionist, a young woman Julian had hired, offering a gentle smile that felt like a mask of lead. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every polite greeting a potential lie. He had spent the morning in his office playing his part. He'd praised Amelia for her meticulous preparation of the meeting documents, his voice calm and warm even as his stomach churned with revulsion. He'd had a brief, cordial phone call with Julian, agreeing to a pre-meeting lunch to go over the final exciting details. Each word of deception was a small sacrifice, a necessary poison he had to swallow. Just before noon, his desk phone buzzed. It was the receptionist. Mr. Finch, there is a young girl here to see you. And Alara, she says you left your scarf in her grandmother's car. The fabricated story was clumsy. Clearly a child's invention, but the name sent a jolt of alarm through Alistair. What was she doing here? Arthur's warning about her safety echoed in his mind. Send her up, Mary, thank you, he said, keeping his voice even. I'll come out to meet her. He stood, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He walked out of his office, his eyes scanning the large, open-plan executive floor. Amelia was at her desk, her back to him, engrossed in a phone call. He started towards the lifts, a sense of foreboding settling upon him. Alara was waiting for him in the main reception lobby on the ground floor. She was standing near the large bay window that overlooked the courtyard, clutching a small rolled-up drawing. She looked small and out of place amidst the polished marble and imposing portraits of his ancestors. He saw the scarf in question, a cashmere Burberry he hadn't even realized was missing, draped over her arm. Alara, he began, his voice a low, urgent whisper. It's not safe for you to be here. Before she could reply, the smooth, confident click of heels on marble announced another presence. Amelia Vance had appeared as if from nowhere, a takeaway coffee cup in her hand. She had clearly finished her call and come down, perhaps out of suspicion or simply a need to control every aspect of Alistair's day. She stopped short, her perfectly manicured eyebrows rising in a look of polite, condescending inquiry. Her gaze swept over Alara, taking in the worn coat and second-hand trainers. It was a look that dismissed the child entirely, classifying her as dirt on a pristine floor. Alistair, is everything all right? Amelia asked, her voice oozing with false concern. Who is this? A small matter, Amelia? Nothing to trouble yourself with? Alistair said, trying to position himself slightly in front of Alara. But Amelia's eyes were fixed on the child. A flicker of something cold and unpleasant passed through her expression. Perhaps she recognized her from the previous evening, a half-seen figure in the shadows of the building. Alara, feeling the woman's hostile gaze, took a small, nervous step back. In doing so, she unrolled the drawing she was holding, revealing it. It was a surprisingly skillful sketch of the Finch & Sons building, rendered in charcoal with a large, benevolent-looking owl, the company's colophon, perched on the roof. "I drew this for you," Alara said quietly to Alistair, holding it up. Amelia let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound devoid of any real humor, like ice cracking. "How quaint," she said. And then it happened. In a movement that was too swift to be accidental, yet just clumsy enough to be deniable, Amelia stumbled. Her arm lurched forward, and the contents of her cup, a cold, dark iced coffee, arced through the air. It landed squarely on the drawing. The dark liquid instantly soaked the paper, the charcoal lines blurring into an ugly, meaningless smudge. A few cold, sticky drops spattered onto Alara's coat. The lobby, which had been humming with the quiet activity of a few passing employees and couriers, fell silent. Everyone saw it. The deliberate, casual cruelty of the act was unmistakable. Alara stared at her ruined drawing, her lower lip trembling. She didn't cry, but her eyes, when she lifted them, were filled with a shock and hurt so profound it was like a physical blow. Amelia feigned a gasp of theatrical horror. "Oh my goodness, I'm so terribly clumsy," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with insincerity. She dabbed at the air with a napkin from her pocket. "It's completely ruined. What a shame." She then looked directly at Alara, her blue eyes as cold as chips of ice. But then places like this aren't really for street children, and their little scribbles are. Accidents happen when people are where they don't belong. The public humiliation, the pointed insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The few employees who had witnessed the scene quickly looked away, suddenly intensely interested in their shoes or phones, unwilling to challenge Alistair's powerful assistant. Alistair felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a rage so white-hot it burned away all pretense, all strategy. For a moment he forgot Arthur's plan, forgot the need for subtlety. All he saw was the malicious smirk on Amelia's face and the silent, wounded devastation in a child's eyes. He took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. He opened his mouth to unleash the furious words dammed up inside him, but then he caught Alara's eye. She gave her head the slightest, almost imperceptible shake. Her expression was no longer just hurt. It was a warning. Don't her eyes seem to say, "Don't let her win." Not like this. Her quiet strength doused his fury like a bucket of cold water. She was right. An outburst would only confirm their narrative of him as an emotional, unstable old man. It would ruin everything. He forced himself to take a deep, steadying breath. He unclenched his fist. He turned to Amelia, his face a mask of calm, grandfatherly disappointment. "Indeed, Amelia," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Accidents do happen. Do be more careful in the future." He then knelt down, ignoring the ruin of his expensive suit trousers on the damp floor. He gently took the soggy, ruined drawing from Alara's small, cold hands. "As for this," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear, "I believe this is the most valuable piece of art I've received in a very long time. It shows a love for this building that some people," he paused, his eyes flicking up to meet Amelia's, "seem to have forgotten." He carefully folded the ruined paper and placed it in his inside jacket pocket close to his heart. He then took the scarf from Alara's arm. "Thank you for returning this, my dear," he said gently. "Now, I think it's time you went home." He walked her to the door, his hand a protective shield on her back, leaving Amelia standing alone in the center of the silent, watching lobby, her small, cruel victory having curdled into a very public and very pointed rebuke. While Alistair was engaged in his harrowing performance at the office, Arthur Davies was orchestrating a silent, systematic assault from his own command center, a cluttered, book-lined office in a quiet Bloomsbury mews that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and damp tweed. For Arthur, the thrill of the hunt had never faded. It had simply moved from the streets of London to the intricate, shadowy corridors of the digital and financial worlds. His first call was to a man known only as Badger, his former protege in the Met's digital forensics unit. Badger was a pale, nocturnal creature who spoke in clipped sentences and understood the flow of data the way a master mariner understands the tides. Arthur Badger's voice crackled over the secure line. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Finally decided to let me teach you how to use that smartphone properly. "Patience, my boy," Arthur rumbled. "I need you to take a look at a server, discreetly. Finch & Sons Publishing. I suspect a walled garden has been built around the company's financials, and I need a peek over the wall. Finch and Sons Badger sounded intrigued. Aren't they the last of the honest men in that business? Don't tell me the old man's gone crooked. The old man is the target, not the perpetrator, Arthur corrected. I'm sending you the company's IP block and the names of the two individuals in question. Julian Croft, CFO. Amelia Vance, executive assistant to the CEO. Focus on their communications and any file transfers to external entities over the past 2 years. I'm particularly interested in anything related to a company named Vance and Croft Holdings. Vance and Croft. Subtle Badger chuckled dryly. It's like calling your getaway car the Heist Mobile. All right, Arthur, let me see what I can find. I'll need a few hours to slip in and out without ringing any alarm bells. Arthur's second front was more traditional. He made his way to a dusty, cramped office in the back streets of the City of London, the kind of place that still used physical files and whose proprietor remembered when a handshake was a binding contract. The office belonged to Sid Carter, a corporate genealogist, a man who could trace the lineage of a shell company faster than anyone Arthur knew. Sid, a small, bird-like man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, listened intently as Arthur laid out the names, Vance and Croft Holdings. Sid muttered, scribbling on a legal pad. Registered in Panama, I'd wager. They always are. Find its parents, Sid Arthur instructed, and its grandparents. I want to know who owns it, who benefits from it, and what other companies it's been sleeping with. With his 2 lines cast, Arthur returned to his own office and began the meticulous work he loved best, connecting the dots. He started with the basics, running background checks on Julian Croft and Amelia Vance. Julian's was predictable Cambridge education, a steady rise through the ranks at Finch & Sons, a lifestyle that, while comfortable, seemed a little too lavish for his official salary. There were whispers of gambling debts a few years back quickly settled, a potential motive. Amelia Vance's history was more interesting. She came from a working-class family in the East End. She had clawed her way into a secretarial course and then into the corporate world through sheer relentless ambition. There was a story there, Arthur mused, a narrative of perceived injustice of someone who felt the world owed them a debt. Her social media profiles, though carefully curated, showed a taste for luxury goods and expensive holidays that far outstripped a PA's salary. It all pointed to a supplementary and likely illicit source of income. By late afternoon, the threads began to unravel. Badger was the first to report back, his voice buzzing with the thrill of discovery. You were right, Arthur. It's a bloody masterpiece of deception. For the past 18 months, Croft and Vance have been systematically devaluing the company from the inside. They've been using a proxy company, Vance and Croft Holdings, naturally, to purchase foreign and subsidiary rights to the Finch & Sons back catalog, especially the high-value classics. For how much, Arthur asked, already knowing the answer. Pennies on the pound. Badger confirmed. They've been authorizing the sales themselves, burying them in omnibus reports that the old man clearly never read. They've effectively sold off the family silver for the price of scrap metal. The holding company now owns the most profitable assets of Finch & Sons. So when the multinational buys the publisher, they're not just buying a historic name. They're buying back the valuable rights that Croft and Vance already stole and will make a fortune on. It was a brilliant parasitic scheme. They weren't just robbing Alistair on the final sale. They had been bleeding his company dry for years. There's more, Badger added. I found fragments of a deleted email chain between them. They're discussing the final contract. Vance confirms she has swapped page 11 of the document, the liability and indemnity clause. The new page transfers all pre-existing corporate debt directly and personally to the signatory, Alistair Finch. It's a digital smoking gun, Arthur. An hour later, Sid Carter called. Got it, he said, sounding triumphant. Vance and Croft Holdings is owned by another shell company, which is owned by another. But follow the breadcrumbs back far enough, and you get to the sole directors of the parent trust registered in the Cayman Islands, Mr. J. Croft and Ms. A. Vance. They didn't even bother to use aliases. The arrogance is breathtaking. Arthur leaned back in his chair, a grim satisfaction settling over him. He now had it all: the motive, the mechanism, the money trail, and the digital proof of the final decisive act of fraud. He picked up the phone to call Alistair. Julian Croft and Amelia Vance thought they were weaving an intricate, invisible web. But they had made the classic mistake of all arrogant criminals. They had underestimated their opponent, and in doing so had woven not a web but a noose. And Arthur Davies was now ready to help them tighten it. The summons for dinner came via a text message from Julian late that afternoon, an invitation couched in the language of familial affection that now seemed grotesque. Uncle Alistair, I've booked a table for us at the Goring 8 p.m., just the three of us. Let's raise a glass to the future of Finch & Sons. A final meal before the new era begins. My treat. Alistair read the message, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The three of us meant Amelia would be there. It wasn't a family dinner. It was a final inspection of the lamb before the slaughter. They wanted to gauge his mood to ensure his compliance, to revel one last time in their perceived superiority. Arthur's instructions had been clear. You must go. You must play the part. Let them see the gentle, trusting fool they believe you to be. He arrived at the opulent hotel restaurant precisely at 8. The dining room was a sea of white linen, gleaming silver, and hushed, important conversations. Julian and Amelia were already seated at a prime table, a bottle of vintage champagne chilling in a silver bucket beside them. Julian, handsome and confident in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, rose to greet him with a broad, charming smile. Amelia, elegant in a silk cocktail dress, offered a seamless performance of warm deference. "Uncle, you made it," Julian said, clasping Alistair's shoulder with a proprietary air. "I was just telling Amelia how much this night means to me, to us." "It is a momentous occasion," Alistair replied, allowing his voice to carry a note of weary resignation which he knew they would interpret as sadness over the end of an era. An end and a beginning. He sat down the plush velvet of the chair, feeling like a trap. The waiter with practiced grace poured him a glass of champagne. "A toast," Julian said, raising his flute. His eyes sparkled with an almost feverish excitement. "To family, to legacy, and to a very, very prosperous future." To the future, Alistair echoed the taste of the expensive champagne turning to ash in his mouth. He met Amelia's gaze over the rim of his glass. She gave him a small conspiratorial smile, the kind an accomplice might give, and for a sickening moment he felt like he was one of them. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They were both brilliant performers, weaving a seamless narrative of concern and respect around their core of utter contempt. "I do hope you're not feeling too sentimental about tomorrow." Alistair, Amelia said, her voice a soft purr. "We know how much the company's history means to you, but sometimes for an old tree to flourish, the dead wood must be cut away." The insult, so elegantly delivered, was breathtaking. He was the dead wood. He forced a sad, wistful smile. "You are right, of course, Amelia. I have been resistant to change. I've grown old. It's a relief in a way to be passing the burden to younger, more capable shoulders." Julian reached across the table and patted his hand. The touch felt reptilian. "Nonsense, Uncle. This isn't an end for you. It's a glorious retirement. Think of it, no more board meetings, no more payroll worries. You can finally finish your monograph on 18th century printing techniques. Travel. We've secured you a golden parachute that will ensure you live out your days in absolute comfort. A golden parachute." The term was so obscene in its mendacity that Alistair almost choked. They were offering him a parachute riddled with holes while they prepared to push him out of the plane. He simply nodded, feigning gratitude, a quiet predator biding his time. He steered the conversation towards the past, a topic he knew they would find tedious, but would indulge for his sake. He spoke of his father, of the principles upon which the company was founded. He was painting a portrait of the man they believed him to be nostalgic, out of touch, lost in a bygone world. "My father always said that a publisher's only real currency is his integrity," Alistair mused, swirling the wine in his glass. A contract to him was more than just a legal document. It was a gentleman's promise. "Times have changed," Uncle Julian said with a patient, indulgent smile. "The world is a little more complex now. That's why you have us to navigate the complexities." The arrogance was staggering. They were explaining the rules of their new corrupt world to him as if he were a child. Throughout the meal, he watched them. He saw the quick, knowing glances they exchanged when they thought he was looking at the menu. He noticed the way Julian's hand rested possessively on the small of Amelia's back as she returned from the powder room. This was not just a business partnership. It was an intimate conspiracy bound by greed and a shared disdain for him. He felt a profound, aching sorrow, not for the money or the company, but for the boy he had raised. He looked at Julian, trying to see a trace of his sister in his face, a flicker of the grief-stricken child he had comforted so many years ago. He saw nothing, only a cold, rapacious ambition. As the waiter cleared their dessert plates, Amelia slid a thin leather-bound folder across the table. "Just a final courtesy, Alistair," she said smoothly. "A summary of the key points for tomorrow. Julian and I have triple-checked everything. All you need to do is sign where the tabs are placed." Alistair opened the folder. It was a meaningless summary designed to reassure and distract. He pretended to read it, his eyes scanning the words without taking them in. His mind was elsewhere, picturing the real page 11 that Arthur's forensic expert had uncovered. "It all seems to be in order," he said, closing the folder. "Thank you, Amelia. I don't know what I would do without you. You never have to find out." She replied, her smile perfect, her eyes empty. He left them there, making his excuses of being tired before the big day. As he walked out into the cool London night, he felt a strange sense of detachment. The pain and rage were still there, but they were now encased in ice. He had survived the dinner. He had looked into the eyes of his betrayers and shown them only what they wanted to see. He had let them believe their predator was a quiet, harmless old sheep. Tomorrow they would learn how wrong they were. The library in Alistair's Kensington flat, once his sanctuary for quiet contemplation, had been transformed into a command center. By 10 o'clock that night, the great oak desk was no longer a place for reading manuscripts, but a staging ground for a war he never thought he'd have to fight. The air, usually thick with the scent of leather and aging paper, now held the faint, sharp smell of ozone from Arthur Davies's laptop. Arthur, methodical and calm, laid out the fruits of his day's work like a surgeon arranging his instruments. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable, and devastating. First, he began placing a slim file on the polished wood, the money trail. He opened it to reveal a series of flowcharts and bank statements from the Cayman Islands and Panama. Sid Carter did his work. This proves without a shadow of a doubt that Vance and Croft Holdings is a direct funnel. Money flows out of Finch & Sons subsidiary accounts through this labyrinth and lands in accounts to which only Julian Croft and Amelia Vance are signatories. Over £3 million in the last 2 years. Alistair stared at the numbers, the clinical proof of their systematic plunder. Second, Arthur continued sliding another file next to the first, the weapon. He opened it, revealing 2 single sheets of paper, side by side encased in protective plastic sleeves. On the left is page 11 from the original draft of the sale contract sourced from your server's deep archives, standard liability clause. On the right, his finger tapped the second sheet as the version Badger recovered from the deleted email fragments between Vance and Croft. The version she swapped into the final binders, the one that makes you personally liable for all corporate debt past and present, effectively rendering you bankrupt. Seeing the 2 pages together, the subtle venomous change in legal wording made the betrayal starkly physically real. It was a signed confession of their intent. And finally, Arthur said, his voice dropping slightly, the motive in their own words. He turned his laptop around. It showed an audio file ready to play, a remnant of a recorded call made from the boardroom. The IT system in older buildings like yours often has legacy audio capture capabilities for conference calls. They were careless. They thought no one would ever look. He pressed play. Julian's voice, slick and arrogant, filled the quiet room. The old relic won't know what hit him. He's too busy mourning the good old days to read the fine print. Then Amelia's voice, sharp and laced with a chilling amusement. He'll sign with a sad little smile, thank us for our hard work, and by the time he realizes he's lost everything, we'll be in Monaco. It's time he was put out to pasture. It's our turn now. Arthur stopped the recording. The silence that descended was heavier than before, filled with the ghosts of their cruel words. Alistair felt a deep, weary ache, but the rage that had been a burning fire was now a focused, cold point of light. "The plan for tomorrow is simple," Arthur said, closing the laptop. "We let them play their parts. The meeting is scheduled for 10 a.m. The buyers will be there. You will allow Julian and Amelia to make their full presentation. You will let them place the fraudulent contract in front of you. You will let them hand you the pen." He paused for effect. "And at that moment, you will decline to sign. That is when you will present the evidence," he continued. "My man Badger has prepared a seamless presentation that will display all of this on the main boardroom screen. While you are speaking, I will enter accompanied by 2 officers from the fraud squad. They have been briefed. They will wait for your signal to make the arrests. It must be public. It must be undeniable. Their humiliation must be as complete as their betrayal." Alistair nodded slowly, the grim finality of the plan settling over him. It was a perfect trap. An hour later, Arthur had departed, leaving the files and the presentation on a secure USB stick. The storm was poised to break. But before it did, there was one last thing Alistair had to do. He needed to remember who he was fighting for. He drove the Bentley across the city, leaving the quiet wealth of Kensington behind for the gritty, vibrant streets of Lambeth. He carried 2 bags. One was a hamper from Fortnum & Mason filled with food, a thick-crusted loaf of bread, artisanal cheeses, a cooked ham, rich fruitcake, and jars of jam and chutney. The other was a canvas tote bag from a bookshop, heavy with its precious cargo. He was buzzed into the council estate building and climbed the clean but worn concrete stairs to Alara's flat. The door was opened by a woman who must have been her grandmother. She was small and bird-like, with Alara's intelligent eyes, though hers were clouded with the wisdom and weariness of age. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice soft but dignified. She recognized him instantly. "Please come in." The flat was small and sparsely furnished, but it was immaculately clean and filled with a warmth that Alistair's own home so desperately lacked. Alara's drawings were taped to the walls, and books from the local library were piled neatly on a small coffee table. Alara herself was sitting at the kitchen table finishing her homework. Her face lit up when she saw him. "I'm so sorry for what happened to your granddaughter today," Alistair said to the grandmother, whose name he learned was Rose. "It was inexcusable. Alara told me Rose set her gaze steady. She also told me you stood up for her. That means more than you know." Alistair placed the hamper on the small kitchen counter, a small gesture. "I hope you don't mind." He then turned to Alara and handed her the other bag. "And these are for you." Alara's eyes went wide. She reached in and pulled out 3 brand-new hardback books. A beautifully illustrated edition of The Secret Garden, a collection of classic fairy tales, and a thick, glossy book on the art of drawing. She hugged them to her chest as if they were the greatest treasure in the world, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Alistair stayed for only a few minutes, not wanting to intrude. As he was leaving, Rose walked him to the door. "You're a good man, Mr. Finch," she said quietly, her perception cutting through all his layers of wealth and status. "My husband. He worked in your archives for 40 years. He always said the Finches were built on honor. He'd be glad to see it still mean something." Alistair felt a lump form in his throat. He simply nodded, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Rose," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "I promise you, everything is going to be all right." As he walked down the stairs and back out into the London night, the weight of his promise settled upon him. He wasn't just fighting for a company anymore. He was fighting for the memory of an honorable archivist, for a grandmother's dignity, and for a little girl who loved books and drew pictures of owls on rooftops. He was fighting for a world where cruelty and greed did not get the final word. The storm would break tomorrow. And Alistair Finch, for the first time in a long time, was ready to command the lightning. The boardroom at Finch & Sons was a chamber built for history. A long, imposing mahogany table polished to a mirror shine reflected the solemn portraits of Alistair's father and grandfather on the walls. Through the tall, mullioned windows, the London skyline was a gray, indifferent witness. Today, history was about to be made. The air was thick with a tense, manufactured cordiality. On one side of the table sat the acquisition team, 3 sharp-suited executives from the multinational, their expressions a mixture of corporate politeness and predatory impatience. On the other side sat Julian and Amelia. Julian was the picture of confidence, his posture expansive, his smile dazzling. Amelia, seated beside him, was a study in cool, efficient grace, arranging documents with a surgeon's precision. Alistair sat at the head of the table, the patriarch presiding over the sale of his own kingdom. He looked, he knew, exactly as they expected him to, tired, a little sad, but ultimately resigned. He had played his part to perfection, right down to the faint tremor he allowed in his hand as he poured himself a glass of water. "If everyone is ready," Julian began, his voice resonating with practiced authority, "we can begin. On behalf of my Uncle Alistair Finch and the entire board, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our friends at Omnicorp Global. This is a historic day, a day where we honor our storied past by embracing a bold new future." For the next 30 minutes, Julian delivered a masterful presentation. With Amelia clicking through the slides, he painted a glowing picture of Finch & Sons' potential, once unshackled from legacy constraints. He spoke of synergy, of market expansion, of shareholder value. It was a flawless performance filled with all the right words and signifying nothing of the truth. Alistair listened in quiet, cold detachment, feeling like a visitor from another planet. Finally, Julian arrived at his grand finale, and so he concluded, his smile broadening. It all comes down to this: a partnership that will redefine the publishing landscape for the 21st century. Amelia stood and with a reverential air placed a thick leather-bound document in front of Alistair. It was the final contract. She opened it to the last page where a series of yellow tabs marked the lines for his signature. She placed a heavy gold-plated fountain pen, his father's pen, which she had taken from his desk, neatly beside it. "Whenever you're ready, Alistair," she said, her voice a soft, triumphant purr. The room held its breath. The Omnicorp executives leaned forward slightly. Julian's eyes were fixed on the tip of the pen, gleaming with a hungry, victorious light. This was their moment, the culmination of years of patient, venomous work. Alistair looked down at the contract, at the empty line waiting for his name. He looked at the pen. He let the silence stretch, drawing it out until it became uncomfortable. Then he folded his hands on top of the closed document and looked up, his gaze sweeping across the expectant faces. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Julian's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "I'm sorry, Uncle. Did you say something?" "I said no." Alistair repeated, his voice now clear and strong, stripped of all its earlier frailty. "I will not be signing this document. Not today, not ever." A murmur of confusion went through the Omnicorp team. Amelia's face tightened, the first crack in her placid facade. "Uncle, are you feeling all right?" Julian asked, his voice laced with a new sharp edge of irritation, perhaps a moment of confusion. "We've been over this. It's all agreed." "Oh, we have been over it," Alistair said, a cold, grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "But I believe we have been reading from two very different versions of the story." He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the small, secure USB stick Arthur had given him. He calmly inserted it into the port at the head of the table. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice now commanding the room, "I would like to make my own presentation. A small addendum, if you will." He clicked the mouse. The large screen behind him, which moments before had been showing Julian's triumphant sales projections, flickered to life. It showed the two versions of page 11 side by side, the damning clauses highlighted in red. "Gentlemen of Omnicorp," Alistair said, his voice ringing with a newfound power, "you were told you were buying a company. What you were in fact participating in was the final act of a conspiracy to commit fraud and bankrupt me personally. This contract," he tapped the leather binder in front of him, "is a weapon. And these," he gestured to Julian, "and Amelia are the assassins." Amelia went white as a sheet. Julian shot to his feet, his face a mask of outrage. "This is preposterous. My uncle is unwell. He's having some sort of paranoid episode. Am I—" Alistair clicked the mouse again. The screen now displayed the intricate web of shell companies, the flow of stolen money, the undeniable link to Vance and Croft Holdings. "Does this look like the work of a confused mind, Julian, or does it look like grand larceny?" the lead Omnicorp executive. A man with cold, calculating eyes looked from the screen to Julian, his expression hardening into one of utter disgust. He had been made a fool of, and he knew it. "I have no idea what this is." Julian blustered, his voice rising in panic. "This is fabricated nonsense, is it?" Alistair's voice was dangerously quiet. He clicked the mouse a final time. The audio file began to play. Julian's and Amelia's voices, filled with contempt and arrogance, echoed through the stunned silence of the boardroom. The old relic won't know what hit him. By the time he realizes he's lost everything, we'll be in Monaco. Amelia collapsed back into her chair as if her bones had dissolved. Julian stood frozen, his face crimson, his mouth opening and closing silently. Their public, professional, and personal worlds had just been utterly and irrevocably annihilated. At that precise moment, the boardroom doors opened. Arthur Davies entered, flanked by two uniformed police officers and a plain-clothed detective from the fraud squad. "Julian Croft, Amelia Vance." The detective said, his voice calm and official. "I'm arresting you on suspicion of conspiracy to defraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." As the officers moved forward, Julian finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate cry of pure rage. "You!" he screamed at Alistair. "You set me up. After everything I did for this company." Alistair rose slowly from his chair, his stature seeming to have grown. He looked at the nephew he had loved, the man who had tried to destroy him, and felt not hatred, but a vast empty pity. "You did nothing for this company, Julian," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You did it all for yourself. You dug your own grave. I merely provided the occasion for you to lie in it." The click of handcuffs fastening around Julian's and Amelia's wrists was the final, definitive sound. The gambit was over. The king had not been checkmated. He had taken the board. The aftermath of the arrests was a quiet, controlled storm. The Omnicorp executives, after a brief, tense consultation with their legal team, departed with tight-lipped apologies and palpable relief at having dodged a bullet. The police efficiently gathered the evidence, their calm professionalism a stark contrast to the emotional wreckage left in the room. Through it all, Alistair remained at the head of the great mahogany table, a silent, solitary figure surveying the battlefield. When the room was finally empty save for him and Arthur, a profound silence descended. It was the silence of a fever that had broken. Arthur walked to the window, looking down at the courtyard where 2 days earlier, a small girl in a worn coat had changed the course of history. "It's done," Arthur said, his voice softer than usual. "They've been taken to Charing Cross for processing. Their assets will be frozen by morning. They won't see the outside of a courtroom for a very long time." Alistair nodded, feeling not the elation of victory, but the deep, hollow ache of a necessary amputation. He had saved the company, but he had lost a nephew. Or rather, he had lost the illusion of a nephew he thought he had. "What will you do now?" Alistair, Arthur asked, turning from the window. "I have no idea," Alistair confessed. "The sale is off, but the problems Julian created are real. The company is wounded." He ran a hand over his face. "For the first time in my life, Arthur, I feel adrift." Perhaps Arthur suggested gently, "You should start with the person who provided you with a lifeline." The words resonated with a simple, undeniable truth. He owed Alara more than just a thank you and a hamper of expensive food. He owed her a future. He owed her safety. That evening, Alistair drove again to the council estate in Lambeth. This time he didn't call first. He just appeared a man seeking not to give charity but to find a connection. Rose, Alara's grandmother, opened the door, her expression of surprise quickly shifting to one of deep concern as she saw the profound weariness in Alistair's eyes. She ushered him in, sat him down at the small kitchen table, and made him a cup of strong, sweet tea, moving with the quiet, intuitive grace of someone who understood sorrow. Alara was there, sitting on the sofa, sketching in a new notepad with the charcoal pencils he had bought her. She looked up and gave him a small, hopeful smile. "It's over," Alistair said, his voice rough with emotion. "They're gone. The company is safe, and it's all because of you, Alara." Rose sat opposite him, her hands folded on the worn tablecloth. "That girl," she said, her voice filled with a fierce, quiet pride, "has a spirit that's too big for this little flat." They talked for over an hour. Alistair, for the first time, spoke not as a CEO, but as a man. He spoke of his loneliness, of his late wife, of the betrayal that had cut him to the core. Rose, in turn, told him of her own life. She spoke of her husband, Michael, a man Alistair now realized he remembered well. Michael loved Finch and Sons Rose, recalled her eyes distant with memory. He wasn't just an archivist, he was its guardian. He knew the story of every book, every author. He used to say the company had a soul. He'd come home smelling of old paper and tell me stories. When he passed, a part of that soul went with him. As she spoke, Alistair felt a profound sense of connection, a thread of shared history weaving itself around them. This wasn't a stranger's family. This was a Finch and Sons family. Michael had dedicated his life to preserving the legacy Alistair had almost lost. Rose, Alistair began the idea forming in his mind with absolute clarity and rightness. Your health. You mentioned it's not what it once was. Alara, she is an extraordinary child. She deserves every opportunity, every chance in the world. He hesitated, searching for the right words. I have a large, empty home, and an even emptier life. I would like to help, not with money, but with everything. He looked from Rose to Alara, who was now listening intently, her drawing forgotten. I would like to become Alara's legal guardian. He said the words feeling more real and true than any business contract he had ever signed. I would ensure her education and her well-being. I would give her a home, and in return, his voice broke slightly, she would give me a family again. He wasn't proposing an adoption out of pity or a sense of transactional debt. It was something more. It was a recognition of a bond that had been forged in a crisis, a bond of loyalty that ran deeper than blood. It was a chance to rebuild not just a company, but a life. Rose looked at him, her wise old eyes searching his face. She saw no pity, only a deep, abiding sincerity. She saw a lonely man who needed a purpose as much as her granddaughter needed a future. She then looked at Alara, whose own eyes were shining with an emotion Alistair couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of awe, hope, and a strange sort of recognition, as if she were seeing a destiny she had always known was hers finally fall into place. "This is Alara's decision," Rose said softly. Alistair turned to the little girl. Alara slid off the sofa and walked over to him. She didn't say anything. She simply reached out her small hand and placed it in his large one. Her touch was a confirmation, an acceptance, a beginning. In that small, humble living room, far from the polished mahogany and cold betrayals of the boardroom, a new family was being formed. It wasn't a family of bloodlines or legal documents, not yet. It was a family born of shared values, of quiet courage, and of the profound, simple truth that sometimes the family you choose is the one that truly saves you. Alistair Finch had set out to rescue his company's legacy and had, in the process, stumbled upon his own. 6 months later, the boardroom at Finch & Sons felt like a different world. The oppressive silence of conspiracy had been replaced by a low, energetic hum of activity. Sunlight, once seeming hesitant to enter, now streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny dancing sparks of possibility. The company was wounded, but under Alistair's newly engaged leadership, it was healing. The legal fallout had been swift and brutal. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, Julian and Amelia had pleaded guilty to avoid a drawn-out, humiliating public trial. Julian received a sentence of 10 years for fraud and embezzlement, Amelia 7. Their assets were seized, the stolen money was repatriated, and their names became a cautionary tale whispered in the exclusive clubs and wine bars of the city. Alistair felt no triumph in their downfall, only a quiet, somber sense of justice served. Today, however, was not about looking back. Alistair stood before his entire staff, from the senior editors to the mailroom clerks, who were all gathered in the company's grand cathedral-like library. It was the first all-hands meeting he had called in over 5 years. He looked out at their faces, anxious, curious, hopeful. He saw the receptionist Mary, who had bravely given a statement about Amelia's cruelty. He saw the young IT expert who had helped Badger, now promoted. He saw 100 people whose livelihoods he had nearly lost. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear and steady, amplified by the room's natural acoustics. "As you all know, Finch & Sons has been through a storm that threatened to tear down the very foundations of this house. But we are still standing." He paused, letting the words sink in. This storm, however, was not without its lessons. It taught me that I had become a custodian of a legacy, but I had stopped being its author. I had mistaken delegation for leadership and silence for stability. I allowed a culture to grow where an employee's worth was measured by their title, not their character, where a child could be humiliated in our lobby and good people felt they had to look away. That ends today. A new energy stirred in the room. This was not the speech they had been expecting. Effective immediately, Alistair announced, "We are canceling all negotiations for the sale of this company. Finch & Sons is not for sale." A wave of audible relief followed by spontaneous applause swept through the library. Alistair held up a hand, a genuine smile on his face. "But we are not going back to the way things were. We are moving forward. Today, I am announcing the formation of the Michael and Rose Foundation, named for a loyal archivist and his courageous wife." He gestured to the side of the room where Rose was sitting, her eyes shining with tears. "This foundation, funded by the recovered assets and a portion of company profits, will be dedicated to fostering literacy and artistic talent in underprivileged children across London. It will provide scholarships, art supplies, and mentorship." He then looked towards the front row, where Alara was sitting dressed in a new school uniform, her posture straight and proud. "The Foundation's first act," Alistair continued, his voice thick with pride, "will be to award a full scholarship for a place at the City of London School for Girls to its honorary junior chairperson, Ms. Alara Miller." The staff turned as one to look at the little girl, who blushed but did not look away. In that moment, they all understood. This wasn't just about charity. It was about a fundamental shift in the soul of the company. It was Alistair's public and meaningful act of reparation, his promise to build a more humane future. Later that afternoon, the library was quiet again. Alistair and Alara sat together in a comfortable reading nook, a soft shaft of afternoon light falling across them. Alara was no longer the frightened, huddled figure from the Bentley. She was a confident, thriving girl, her mind as sharp as ever, now nourished by security and love. She had moved into the Kensington flat, filling its gilded silence with laughter, questions, and the happy clutter of a child's life. She was reading aloud from a new edition of The Wind in the Willows, the same book she had clutched for comfort on that fateful night. Her voice was clear and expressive. Alistair wasn't really listening to the words. He was listening to the music of her presence, a sound that had healed the aching loneliness in his heart. "Dad," she asked, looking up from the page. She had started calling him that a month ago, the word both perfectly natural and breathtakingly profound. "Yes, my dear. Do you think Grandma Rose knew this would happen?" She asked, her expression serious with the peculiar wisdom of children. "When she told me stories about this place being magic," Alistair thought for a moment, looking around at the magnificent room, at the thousands of stories bound in leather and cloth that lined the walls. He remembered the perfect, terrible storm of chance events, the faulty car latch, the forgotten ventilation grate, the child with a love for old books. "I think Alara," he said softly, putting an arm around her small shoulders, "that your grandmother was a very wise woman. I think she knew that the best stories aren't about magic. They're about ordinary people choosing to be brave. And I think," he added, his voice full of a quiet, unshakable joy, "she would be very proud to see how you saved our family, and in doing so taught an old publisher how to write a new chapter." Alara smiled, a bright, beautiful smile that lit up the old room. She leaned her head against his shoulder and continued to read. Outside, the city of London churned on a vast, complex narrative of its own. But here, in the quiet heart of a publishing house that had rediscovered its soul, a man and his daughter had found their own story. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, and it promised to be the best one ever written.